I found this drill press on Craigslist a few months back, but the only thing I had to put it on was this tiny rolling cart. Time to fix that. The only thing I liked about the rolling cart was that it had room for my belt sander underneath. I built my planer cart from a 1x4 frame, and it's incredibly sturdy, so I decided to use the same design concept. I sketched out some plans for a new stand incorporating space for my belt sander and room for some drawers. As is quickly becoming tradition, I scrawled out my cut list on my workbench. Everything will be joined with pocket screws. The goal was to use up a bunch of scrap that I had lying around my shop. Instead of just buying 1x4s, I decided to rip them from 1x12s. I think it was a little cheaper to go this way. I was a little short on material after I ripped what I had on hand, so I resawed some unused 2x4 laminations from a previous project. I laid out the cuts using an online calculator and cut everything to size at the miter saw. I used the adjustable roller bars on my portable stand as makeshift stop blocks. Time for a pocket hole montage. I recently upgraded to the Craig K5 and it really helps when you're drilling this many holes. Much easier to work with than my old R3. I assembled each of the outer frames using glue and 1 1/4 inch pocket screws. Now, around this point you may notice that I have sawed one of the frames in half. When I made my design, I miscalculated the required width of the back frame. I thought maybe I could cut it down and make it sturdy enough to make up for my mistake. After glaring at the project and realizing that things still didn't line up, I removed the screws from the offending pieces, broke them off before the glue set completely, and cut new pieces for the back panel off camera. With everything finally assembled, I added cross supports for the drawer slides. These were cut to length, then finessed to final size on the belt sander, then secured in place using pocket screws. I used a scrap piece of wood as a spacer to make sure both sides lined up. The frame was sanded at 80 grit and then 120, mostly just to smooth out any uneven edges between the panels. At this point, I realized my haphazard design process had yet again caused a problem. The edges on the case were out of alignment. I threw together a quick jig and used my router to trim the edges to match across all sides. It came out a little uneven, but it was much better than it was beforehand. I ripped the drawer slides out of some pine scraps and cut them to length. The slides were glued and brad nailed into place, again using a spacer to ensure that they were spaced equally on both sides. The excess was cut off with a pole saw. I had lots of plywood scraps lying around, so I picked out some that were big enough to skin the case. I used 1/2 inch on the sides, 1/4 on the back, and a nice thick 3/4 inch for the top. Rather than try to get the dimensions down perfect, I cut these all slightly larger than required. After gluing and nailing them into place, I used a flush trim bit on my router to clean up the edges. This process was repeated for all of the sides. I did the top and bottom last so that they would cover all the exposed edges of the sheets used for the sides and back. My shop is a small 1-car garage, so everything I have has to be on wheels. I attached these 3-inch casters from Harbor Freight to the bottom. With the case complete, I moved on to the drawers. All of the drawer pieces were cut from 1/2 inch plywood offcuts that were lying around the garage. The top drawer is 4 inches deep, the middle 5 inches deep, and the bottom is 6 inches deep. All the drawer pieces were cut to size back at the miter saw. I decided to use rabbets for the drawer assembly. I find that pocket holes in 1/2-inch plywood don't work too well since the wood is slightly thinner than 1/2 inch, and I wanted to try something new anyway. I cut these rabbets with a dado blade on my table saw. I cut more rabbets into the bottom of each piece so that I could set in the drawer bottoms. I've done floating panel drawer bottoms before, but I wanted to maximize storage space. Also, this way, if I beat up the drawer bottoms, they are easy to remove and replace. All of the drawer boxes were assembled using glue and brad nails. After assembly, I measured the opening in the bottom and cut the panels to size. I ran out of 1/4 inch plywood for the last drawer, so I decided to use a piece of pegboard that has been sitting in my shop for about 2 years. I guess I'm glad I hung on to it after all. The bottoms were attached using, you guessed it, brad nails and glue. I cut grooves in the sides of each box for the drawer slides to ride on by making multiple passes on the table saw. I usually prefer if the grooves don't run all the way through the sides, but I built the boxes a little too big this time. They still work fine. I used an 1/8 inch bar to get a uniform space between the drawer fronts, then clamped the face to the drawer. The drawer is then removed and 2 small screws are driven to hold the front in place. I marked the center of each drawer face and drilled a pilot hole through the drawer. I drove in screws from the inside and mounted these little hardwood drawer pulls I had left over from the planer cart build. With that, the project was done. This was a nice quick build that only took me 2 full days to finish. I already have gotten way more use out of my drill press now that it's more accessible. I also finally have a home for my drill bits and many other small accessories. If I ever build another one, I'd just make it a few inches shorter. I probably forgot to incorporate the casters when I was calculating the final size. It still works great though. I hope you enjoyed this build video. You can follow me on Instagram at dbbuilds to see what I'm up to next. Thanks again for watching.